The story of the orc mother who walked out of the mountains is not about the hunger that drove her, but the smallness of the thing that saved her. It is the story of a single bowl of milk offered on a human's porch, and the man who offered it, who had no idea he was about to remake the world. He had no idea that by feeding one starving child, he was planting a forest. By the way, wherever in the world you're listening from right now, drop it in the comments. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Okay, where were we? The dust of the low road was pale and fine, clinging to the cracked leather of her boots and the coarse hem of her tunic. It rose in little puffs with every step, a soft explosion of despair. Her name was Ygritte, and the child she carried on her hip, Grok, was 4 years old and weighed no more than a bundle of dry sticks. His head rested heavily in the hollow of her shoulder, his breath a shallow, rhythmic whisper against her neck. He had not cried for a full day. The silence was worse than the sound. She had been walking for 2 days, following the line where the granite teeth of the Broken Fang Mountains gave way to the soft green fields of the human valley. The stories her clan told of this place were grim. Humans were brittle, faithless, quick to light torches and raise pitchforks. They saw orcs as beasts, monolithic and savage, creatures of rock and rage. And perhaps they were right. She felt the rock in her bones, the rage a cold stone in her gut. But the hunger was a sharper thing than any fear. Hunger ate rage. It ate pride. It was eating her son. Ahead, a plume of smoke curled into the flat grey sky, a single, unwavering line. A homestead, the last one before the town of Oakhaven proper. A split rail fence, grey with age, marked the property line. Beyond it, a field of turned earth lay sleeping under the sky, and past that, a stone and timber house sat beside a large barn, both sturdy and plain. There was a stillness to the place, a settled quiet that felt both ancient and empty. She stopped at the fence, her body a taut wire of indecision. Turning back meant returning to the slow starvation orchestrated by Gorgoth, the new clan warden, who called control tradition. Moving forward meant facing the unknown violence of humans. Grok stirred against her, a small whimper finally breaking from his lips. It was that sound, thin and reedy, that made the choice for her. She unlatched the simple wooden gate, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence, and walked toward the house. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She prepared the words in the clumsy common tongue she knew. Just a little work, for food, just for the boy. She expected a slammed door, a shout, the glint of steel. She braced herself for the familiar shape of rejection, a posture she had learned and perfected over the last year. Her shoulders hunched, her head bowed, a shield against the inevitable blow. She walked up the 3 stone steps to the porch and did not knock. She simply stood, a statue of desperate appeal, and waited to be seen. The door opened. The man who stood there was not what she expected. He was not large or loud. He was of middling height, with hair the colour of sun-bleached straw and eyes the grey of the winter sky. His face was geography, mapped with lines of sun and work and some deeper, quieter sorrow. His hands, which rested on the doorframe, were large and calloused, the knuckles scarred. They were farmers' hands, hands that knew the language of soil and wood and stone. He looked at her, then his gaze dropped to the child, and the hard set of his mouth softened by a fraction. He did not speak. He just looked, his silence a heavy blanket. Ygrid's own voice was a dry rasp. "Work," she said, the words scraping her throat. "For food. For him." She tilted her head toward Grok. The man's grey eyes stayed on the boy. He saw the hollows in the child's cheeks, the bluish tint to his lips, the utter limpness of him. He saw the fierce, terrified hope in the mother's eyes, the way she held her son as if he were the last ember of a dying fire. For a full minute, he said nothing. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then he stepped back, pulling the door wider. "Bring him in," he said. His voice was like his hands, rough but steady. "There's milk on the hearth." It was not the welcome she had hoped for. Hope was a luxury she could not afford. It was not the rejection she had braced for. It was something else entirely, something she had no name for. It was a simple, unadorned fact, an open door, a promise of milk. Ygritte hesitated for only a second, then stepped over the threshold, out of the dust and into the quiet sorrow of his home. The man's name was Arthur. He had lived alone in this house for 5 years, since the winter fever had taken his wife, Alara. The house was a monument to her absence. On the mantelpiece above the cold hearth sat a small wooden bird, carved from a single piece of pale birch, its head cocked as if listening for a sound that never came. Alara had carved it the month before she died. Arthur dusted it every morning, his rough fingers gentle on its smooth surface. It was the one object in the house he allowed himself to touch with tenderness. Everything else was function. The chairs were for sitting, the table for eating, the bed for sleeping. The silence was for remembering. He moved with the economy of a man long accustomed to solitude. He took a clay mug from a hook, ladled it full of milk warming by the fire, and held it out, not to Ygritte, but toward the child. She shifted Grok in her arms, and the boy, smelling the warm, sweet scent, opened his eyes. They were large and dark, and they fixed on the mug with an intensity that made Arthur's chest ache. Ygritte took the mug, her hand trembling slightly, and held it to her son's lips. Grok drank. He drank with a desperate, gulping thirst that was painful to watch. Milk dribbled down his chin, and Ygritte wiped it away with her thumb, her expression a mixture of profound relief and shattering shame. She did not drink any herself. When the mug was empty, Grok sighed, a deep, shuddering sound, and his body went lax in her arms, falling into a true, healing sleep. Arthur had turned away, giving her the privacy of the moment. He was stoking the fire, the scrape of the iron poker against the stone the only sound. "There's bread and cheese on the table," he said, his back still to her, "and a bed in the barn. The hay is fresh." Ygritte set the empty mug down carefully. "The work," she said, her voice still hoarse. "I will work." She would not accept charity. Charity was a hook, a debt that could be called in later, with interest she could not pay. Arthur turned from the fire. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He saw the proud set of her jaw, the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the strength in the line of her shoulders despite her thinness. She was not a beggar. She was a survivor, bartering her last coin, her own labor. "The woodpile needs splitting for winter," he said, his tone matter of fact. "And the north fence is down in 2 sections. The posts need setting before the ground freezes." "I can split wood," she said. "I am strong." It was a simple statement of fact. "The work is worth food and shelter, for you and the boy, for as long as the work lasts." He made it a transaction, clean and clear, an exchange. He saw the tension in her shoulders ease just slightly. Dignity was a kind of food too, and he had just offered her a piece. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Thank you." "My name is Arthur." She hesitated, her own name feeling foreign on her tongue after so long being defined only as widow or Gorgoth's claim. "Ygritte." He nodded, accepting it. He pointed to a worn armchair near the fire. "Rest. The work can wait for the morning." She did not take the chair. Instead, she slid down to sit on the floor, her back against the wall, the sleeping grok cradled in her lap. It was a position of temporary safety, not of comfort. From here she could see the door. From here she could be ready to run. Arthur watched her for a moment, then turned back to his chores, moving around his quiet house as if she were not there. But she was. A green-skinned woman and her half-starved child, a disruption to the perfect, sterile silence he had so carefully cultivated for 5 years. The house did not feel empty anymore. It felt occupied. And as he looked at the untouched wooden bird on the mantel, he felt the first, unfamiliar flicker of something other than grief. It was not warmth, not yet. It was just a quiet disturbance in the settled dust of his life. The next morning, Ygritte was awake before the sun. She left Grok sleeping on a pile of hay in the barn, wrapped in a thick wool blanket Arthur had left for them, and went to the woodpile. The chopping block was a massive, scarred stump of oak. The splitting axe leaned against it, its steel head gleaming faintly in the pre-dawn light. She picked it up. The heft of it was familiar, comfortable. In her clan, this was men's work, but she had often chopped wood for her own fire after her mate was killed. She had learned the rhythm of it, the way to read the grain, the precise point of impact that would cleave a log in 2 with a single, satisfying crack. She set a thick round of ash on the block, took her stance, and swung. The axe came down, true and hard. The wood split with a sound like a gunshot in the morning stillness. She set the 2 halves aside and placed another on the block. Swing, crack, stack. Swing, crack, stack. It was a meditation. The clean, physical work pushed aside the gnawing anxiety. the constant fear. Here there was only the axe, the wood, and the growing pile of fuel that meant warmth, that meant life. When Arthur came out of the house with a bucket of milk from the morning's cow, he stopped and watched her. She moved with a fluid, powerful grace. There was no wasted motion. Her shoulders, broad and strong, put all her weight into the swing. She did not chop at the wood. She persuaded it to part. He had seen men half again her size struggle with the same knotty pieces of ash she was splitting with ease. The pile of split wood beside her was already impressively high. She sensed him watching and stopped, the axe held loosely in her hand. She immediately looked down, her apology reflexive. "I am sorry if I woke you." "You didn't," he said, his voice neutral. He walked over and picked up one of the split logs. The break was clean, perfect. "You have a good eye for the grain." It was a simple observation, a statement of fact, but it landed on her like a physical touch. Praise was a foreign language. Gorgarth had only ever spoken in commands and criticisms. She didn't know how to respond. She just stood there, the axe feeling suddenly heavy in her hand. He gestured with his head toward the house. "There's porridge on the stove. Bring the boy." She found Grok awake, sitting up in the hay, looking small and lost in the vast, shadowed space of the barn. But his cheeks had a touch of colour this morning. His eyes were clearer. When he saw her, a tiny smile touched his lips. It was the first time she had seen him smile in a month. Something in her chest, a knot of ice she hadn't even known was there, began to melt. Inside the house, Arthur had set 3 bowls on the table, one for him, one for her, one for the boy. He had not asked if they would eat with him. He had simply made the space. Ygritte hesitated at the threshold of the main room. The barn had felt like a temporary shelter. The house felt different, more permanent, more dangerous. "Come," Arthur said, not looking at her. He was already sitting, spooning porridge into his own bowl. Grok, however, had no such reservations. He saw the food and scrambled onto one of the chairs, his small hands gripping the edge of the table as he stared at the steaming bowl. Ygritte followed him, seating herself stiffly, her back straight, as if expecting a blow. They ate in silence. It was not the oppressive silence of the barn, nor the empty silence of Arthur's grief. It was a new silence, filled with the small sounds of spoons scraping against clay, of a child's contented sighs. After the meal, as Ygritte was getting ready to return to the woodpile, Arthur stopped her. "The boy," he said. "He shouldn't be alone in the barn." "He will be quiet," she said immediately. "He will not be a bother." "That's not what I mean," Arthur said, a flicker of impatience in his voice. He seemed unused to explaining himself. He looked at Grok, who was now carefully examining the carved wooden bird on the mantel, his small fingers tracing its wings without quite touching it. "There's a room upstairs. It is empty. He can stay there. You can stay there." Ygritte stared at him. The barn was one thing. A room inside the house was another. It was an offering that felt too large, too generous. It felt like a trap. "The barn is fine," she said, her voice tight. "It will be cold tonight," Arthur said simply. "The room is warm. It's a practical matter." He framed it as logistics, not kindness. He seemed to understand instinctively that kindness was a currency she did not trust. But practicality, exchange, a warm room for a day's work, that was a language she understood. She looked from Arthur's impassive face to her son, who was now whispering to the wooden bird, a soft, burbling sound of pure childhood. The thought of him, warm and safe in a real bed, broke through her defenses. "All right," she said, the word barely audible. Later that day, she moved their few belongings, a spare tunic, a whetstone for her knife, and a small, smooth stone Grok carried for comfort, into the small upstairs room. It was plain, with a narrow bed, a small window looking out over the fields, and a single wooden chest. But it was clean, and the air was dry and warm. It smelled of cedar and old linen. It smelled of safety. That night, for the first time in over a year, Ygritte slept without a knife in her hand. She slept through the night, a deep and dreamless sleep, while her son breathed evenly in the small bed beside her. Downstairs, Arthur sat by the fire, listening to the unfamiliar sound of a sleeping child in the house, and did not feel quite so alone. The days settled into a rhythm. Each morning Ygritte would work. After she had split enough wood to last 2 winters, she started on the fence line. She learned to set the posts, digging the holes in the hard, cold earth, tamping the soil until they were solid and true. Arthur showed her how to stretch the wire, how to tie it off. He spoke little, demonstrating with his hands, and she learned quickly, watching the sure, efficient movements of his scarred fingers. He never complimented her again, but he didn't need to. He would simply inspect her work, give a single satisfied nod, and move on to the next task. The nod was enough. It was a quiet acknowledgement of her competence, her worth. Grok, meanwhile, began to inhabit the world again. The colour returned fully to his cheeks. He grew from a silent, listless shadow into a curious, bright little boy. He followed Arthur around the farm like a small green duckling, chattering in a mixture of the Orcish tongue and the few words of common he was picking up. He asked about the chickens, the cow, the way the water pump worked. Arthur, to his own surprise, found himself answering. He explained things in a low, patient murmur, his words simple and direct. One afternoon, Grok found a patch of late-blooming dandelions behind the barn. He picked a handful and brought them into the house, holding them up to Arthur. "For the bird," he said, pointing to the mantelpiece. Arthur looked at the cheerful yellow weeds, then at the pale, still bird. Ilara had loved dandelions. She called them suns on the earth. He hadn't had a flower in the house in 5 years. He felt a sudden, sharp pang in his chest, a mix of pain and something else, something warm. He took a small glass from the cupboard, filled it with water, and set the dandelions on the mantel, right next to the carved bird. The bright, living colour next to the pale, memorialized wood was a startling contrast. It felt like a sacrilege and a prayer all at once. The room seemed brighter. Ygritte saw the flowers when she came in from the cold, her hands raw from stretching wire. She stopped in the doorway, her eyes fixed on the mantel. She looked at the flowers, then at Arthur. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. She thought he might be angry at the intrusion, the childish disruption of his solemn shrine. "He picked them," she said, her voice quiet, defensive. "I know," Arthur replied, his gaze still on the mantel. "They're good there." That evening, as she was mending a tear in Grock's tunic by the firelight, Ygritte began to hum. It was a low, guttural melody, an old orcish lullaby her own mother had sung to her. It was a tune of mountains and stars, of deep roots and quiet strength. She wasn't aware she was doing it until she saw Arthur had stopped his own work, oiling a piece of leather harness, and was listening. She stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her mouth as if to catch the sound and stuff it back in. A hot flush of shame went through her. Gorgoth had forbidden the old songs. He said they were weak, sentimental things that made the clan soft. He had punished a woman for singing one to her crying child. "I am sorry," she whispered, her head ducked. Arthur did not look up from his work. He just continued to draw the oiled cloth over the leather strap. "It was a nice sound," he said, his voice even. "The house has been quiet for a long time." The simple acceptance of it, the quiet permission, was more disarming than a command. He was not just making room for her and her son in his house. He was making room for their sounds, their colours, their lives. She did not start humming again that night, but the tune stayed in her head, a quiet, defiant melody. She felt a shift inside her, subtle but profound. The fear was still there, a deep, cold stone in her belly, but something new was growing around it. It was growing the way roots grow in the dark, unseen and tenacious, seeking purchase. Arthur had once told her that a field left fallow for too long loses its heart. He said you had to plant something, even a cover crop, to keep the soil alive. She felt as if her own heart, left fallow by grief and fear, was beginning to feel the gentle turn of a plough. A few weeks later, winter arrived in earnest. The first snow came, a fine, dusting powder that outlined every branch and fence post in white. The world grew quieter, the landscape softer. The work on the farm moved indoors. Ygritte learned to mend harnesses, to shell beans for the winter store, to bank the fire so it would last through the night. The three of them existed within the warm stone walls of the house, a small, unlikely island of life in the frozen world. One night, a fierce wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. Grock was long asleep upstairs. Arthur was reading a tattered almanac by the light of a single lamp. Ygritte was sharpening her skinning knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a soothing sound in the warmth of the kitchen. "Gorgoth," Arthur said, the name dropping into the comfortable silence like a stone into a still pond. "You said that was the warden's name." Ygritte's hands froze. She had not spoken the name since the day she'd fled. Just hearing it made the brand on her wrist seem to burn. She looked up and met Arthur's gaze. His grey eyes were steady, patient. He was not demanding, just asking. He was offering her a chance to speak it, to lance the wound and let the poison out. She took a slow, shaky breath. "Yes." "He will come looking for you," Arthur said. It was not a question.
Yes, she confirmed, her voice a whisper. When the snow melts, he will not risk the high passes in a storm, but he will come. He sees me as property, me and the boy, all the widows whose mates have fallen. We are his to command or to give to other warriors. It is his interpretation of the old laws. He calls it protecting the clan. We call it ownership. She pulled up the sleeve of her tunic, revealing the mark on the inside of her wrist. It was a crude brand, the jagged shape of a broken tusk. Gorgoth's clan sigil. It was puckered and ugly against her green skin. He marks his property, she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was a truth she had lived with for so long, it had become a part of her, like a bone. Arthur looked at the brand, and a muscle jumped in his jaw. It was the first time she had ever seen him show a flicker of anger. It was a cold, hard anger, like a chip of flint. He didn't say anything about the mark. He didn't offer pity or outrage. He just looked at it, his eyes recording the fact of it. He uses hunger as a leash, Ygritte continued, the words coming more easily now, a quiet, bitter flood. He controls the clan's food stores. Those who are loyal eat well. Those who question him, their children grow thin. He performs generosity in the open, handing out sacks of grain before the whole clan, but only to those who have already sworn their loyalty. To the rest of us, he offers scraps, and only in exchange for total obedience. I refused to be given to one of his captains, a brute named Raghor, so my portion was cut, and then cut again. Grok. Her voice broke for a moment. Grok began to waste away. I had to leave. I had to. She finished her story, and a heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the howling of the wind. She waited for him to tell her she had to go, that he wanted no trouble, that a clan warden and his warriors were more than he was willing to face for an orc and her child. It was what she would have done in his place. Survival was a selfish, lonely business. But Arthur did not say that. He simply stood up, walked to the hearth, and added another log to the fire. He watched the sparks fly up the chimney. A heart is not a cup you can empty and refill, he said, his voice low and rough. He was speaking as much to himself as to her. It's more like a field. What's planted there stays. The roots are deep. But that doesn't mean you can't plant something new alongside it. He turned to look at her, his face lit by the firelight. You and the boy are here. This is your place until you choose another. When he comes, he will not find you alone. It was not a promise of violence. It was not a boast. It was a statement of fact, as solid and unadorned as the stone walls of his house. He was standing with her, not in front of her, not for her, but with her. A quiet, unshakable alliance. In that moment, Ygritte understood that the deepest kindness was not gentle. It was strong. It was a fence post sunk deep in hard ground that would not break in a storm. For the second time in his presence, she felt the ice around her heart crack, and this time the warmth that seeped in felt like hope. The snows melted. The world turned from white to brown to a vibrant, living green. The fear in Ygrid's belly returned, a low, constant hum of anxiety. Every rider on the road, every distant shout made her flinch. But the work continued. They ploughed the field Arthur had left fallow for 5 years, Ygrid guiding the old mule while Arthur held the plough steady. They planted seeds for beans and squash and corn, their hands moving in the dark, rich soil. They were planting a future, a harvest they might not be there to see. Then one day, he came. Gorgoth did not arrive like a warrior. He arrived like a politician. He rode a large black horse, but he wore no armor, only fine black leathers stamped with his tusk sigil. 2 of his captains flanked him, but they remained at a respectful distance. He did not come to the farmhouse directly, but stopped at the gate, as if waiting for an invitation. By the time Arthur and Ygrid walked out to meet him, a small crowd of neighbours had gathered on the road, drawn by the sight of 3 armed orcs at the edge of Oakhaven. This was precisely what Gorgoth had wanted, an audience. He was a massive orc, even larger than Ygrid remembered, with a face that seemed to be permanently set in a sneer of contempt. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, radiating an aura of absolute authority. "Ygrid," he said, his voice a low boom that carried easily to the watching humans. He did not look at Arthur. "You have caused your warden a great deal of trouble. The clan is worried. Your place is with us. It is time to come home." He made it sound like a rescue. Ygrid's hand went instinctively to the brand on her wrist. Her throat was dry. She could feel the fear coiling in her stomach. But then she felt Arthur's presence beside her. He did not move, did not speak. He just stood there, solid as an oak tree. His quiet strength flowed into her. She lifted her chin. "This is my home now," she said, her voice clearer and stronger than she had expected. Gorgoth's eyes narrowed. For the first time, he acknowledged Arthur, looking him up and down with open disgust. "Human, you are harboring clan property. This is a matter of our law, our tradition. It does not concern you. Give her back, and I will overlook your transgression." He held up a rolled scroll, tied with a leather thong. "I have the writ of wardenship, recognized by the elders. She is my charge. Her son is my charge." He was performing for the crowd, casting himself as the upholder of sacred law, and Arthur as a human meddler, a kidnapper. Ygrid could see the fear and suspicion on the faces of the watching farmers. They were ready to believe him. But Arthur did not rise to the bait. He did not argue or shout. He simply said, "She is not property, and this is my land. You are not welcome here." Before Gorgoth could respond, 2 more figures walked up the lane. One was Martha, Arthur's elderly, no-nonsense neighbour, carrying a covered basket that smelled of fresh bread. The other was Elias, the town's quiet, respected record-keeper, a thin man with spectacles and a mind as sharp as a razor. Arthur had spoken to them the week before. Elias stepped forward, his demeanour mild. "Warden Gorgoth,
I am Elias, keeper of the town records. I have had the opportunity to study the treaties between Oakhaven and the Broken Fang clans. They are very clear. Clan law is sovereign on clan land, but on this side of the river, our laws hold sway, and our laws do not recognize people as property. Gorgoth sneered. Your laws are for humans. She is orc. She is a resident of this valley now, Elias said calmly, and she has claimed sanctuary. As if on cue, a new sound began. It was the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps on the dusty road. Over the rise, another figure appeared. An orc woman, thin and worn, carrying a small child. And then another behind her, and another. One by one they came, the other widows, the other mothers Gorgoth had starved and controlled. There were 12 of them in total, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on Gorgoth. They did not speak. They simply walked up to Arthur's fence and stood behind Ygritte, a silent, unshakable wall of witness. Their children clung to their legs, their wide eyes watching. The sight of them, all of them, standing there in the open, defying him, struck Gorgoth like a physical blow. His performance of authority depended on their silent, individual submission. United, they were a different force entirely. His face, which had been a mask of confident authority, began to crack. A dark, ugly rage seeped through. Traitors! He roared, his voice losing its controlled boom and becoming a raw bellow. You will all starve for this. You are nothing without the clan. Nothing. But his threats sounded hollow now. He was not a warden protecting his people. He was a tyrant who had lost his grip. Ygritte stepped forward. She looked not at Gorgoth, but at the assembled humans. He speaks of tradition, she said, her voice ringing with a truth that needed no volume. The tradition of our people is to protect the weak, to feed the hungry, to honor our widows. He has twisted that tradition to feed his own power. He used our laws to make us slaves. He used our hunger to make us obedient. Look at our children. Look at their faces. That is the truth of his wardenship. The townsfolk looked. They saw not a horde of savage beasts, but a dozen tired, desperate mothers and their thin children. They looked at Gorgoth, his face contorted with rage, and they looked at Arthur, standing quietly beside Ygritte, and they looked at the line of silent, defiant women. And in that moment, the old prejudices, the old fears, began to dissolve under the light of a simple, undeniable truth. Martha, the neighbour, walked past Gorgoth without a glance and handed her basket of bread to one of the mothers. The woman took it, her eyes filling with tears. That one small act of kindness broke the spell. Another farmer stepped forward with a sack of potatoes. A woman offered a thick blanket. Gorgoth stood there, utterly defeated. His authority was a performance, and his audience had just walked off the stage. He had no power here, no laws, no traditions, no fear to wield. He looked at Ygritte, his eyes filled with a black, venomous hatred. Then, without another word, he turned mounted his horse, and rode away. His two captains, after a moment's hesitation, followed him. He did not look back. It was, Ygritte thought, the only honest thing he had ever done. In the quiet aftermath, a new community began to take root at the edge of Oakhaven. Arthur, with the help of Elias and other townsfolk, arranged for the orc mothers to find shelter and work on the surrounding farms. The initial fear and suspicion of the humans gave way to a grudging respect, and then to a simple, neighbourly acceptance. They were no longer orcs. They were Morga, who was good at mending roofs, and Uka, who knew more about herbs than the town healer, and Ygritte, who could split a winter's worth of wood before noon. Life in Arthur's house settled into a new, warmer rhythm. It was no longer quiet. It was filled with the sound of Grok's laughter, the murmur of Ygritte's humming as she worked, the footsteps of neighbours who now stopped by not out of curiosity, but for friendship. One evening in late summer, Arthur took the carved wooden bird from the mantelpiece. For a moment, Ygritte's heart tightened, thinking he was putting it away. But he didn't. He just held it in his palm for a long moment. Then, he reached over and picked up a smooth, grey river stone that Grok had found and placed on the mantel weeks ago. He set the stone down first, then placed the wooden bird beside it. The two objects, one a memory of a love that was gone, the other a symbol of a life that was growing, rested together, grief and joy coexisting. He had made room. He turned to Ygritte. There's a field at the west end of the property. The soil is good, but it's never been planted. I was thinking of putting in an apple orchard. Trees take a long time to grow. They need to be planted by people who plan on staying to see the harvest. He looked at her, his grey eyes clear and direct. Will you plant it with me, Ygritte? It was not a passionate declaration. It was a proposal made of soil and seeds and seasons, a question about a shared future. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. Yes, she said, her voice soft. Yes, Arthur, I will. They were not married by a priest or a warden, but by the turning of the earth. They planted the first sapling together, their hands side by side in the rich, dark soil. Grok was there, patting the earth around the slender trunk with his small hands. As they worked, Ygritte began to hum one of the old lullabies, the one about the deep roots and the quiet strength. This time, she did not stop. She let the melody rise into the clear afternoon air, a sound of reclamation, a sound of peace. Arthur listened, a small, true smile on his face. He had learned that a heart is not a fortress to be guarded against new feelings, but a field to be tended. A heart heals not by forgetting what it has lost, but by making room for what comes after.